We are opening a file today that has been accumulating uh, dust, redactions, and speculation for nearly 80 years.
It really has.
Usually when people talk about this topic, the question is pretty simple, are we alone? But that isn't really the question we're asking today.
No, it's a different angle entirely.
We're looking at the architecture of the silence itself. We're going to examine the history of the conspiracy theory, the human story of the believers, the hoaxers, the intelligence agents, and really the storytellers who built this modern mythology.
And that distinction is crucial. It changes the whole nature of the investigation. If you're looking for physical evidence of, extraterrestrials, you often end up with ambiguous photos or classified radar data.
Right, things you can't quite grasp.
Exactly. But if you look at the history of the belief system, you find concrete documentation.
Yeah.
We can trace precisely when certain ideas entered the public consciousness. We can pinpoint the specific individuals who introduced these concepts of crash saucers, underground bases, and government treaties.
And for our exploration today, we're working from a really extensive stack of documentation. It chronicles the sociological evolution of these theories. We have records from, 1940s pulp magazines, right up to congressional hearings in the 2020s, and some reports from late 2025.
So the objective here is to trace that timeline. We want to understand how the narrative shifted from, say, mystery airships in the early 20th century to the really complex government treaties with aliens narratives that exploded in the 1980s.
We need to identify the specific people and the moments that really altered the mythos.
That's the goal.
And I think we should just add a note on our approach today. This is a historical progression. We're treating this material with the seriousness it deserves as a cultural and political phenomenon. We're not here to mock believers or endorse theories, but simply to report on how this narrative was constructed brick by brick.
Precisely. To understand the present moment, with its disclosure hearings and whistleblowers, we have to understand the foundation. And that foundation wasn't laid in some government laboratory. It was laid in a publishing house in Chicago in the 1940s.
Let's go right back there, the 1940s. Before Roswell was a household name, you had Raymond Palmer. He was the editor of Amazing Stories, a pulp science fiction magazine, and in the history of this whole topic, Palmer is often referred to as the man who invented flying saucers.
And that title isn't entirely hyperbole. Palmer had this unique talent for blurring the line between fiction and reality. He realized that claiming a story was true sold far more magazines than just marketing it as fantasy.
And this started in earnest with something that became known as the Shaver mystery.
It did. A very strange story.
This is a fascinating rabbit hole. So in 1945, Palmer starts publishing these letters and then full stories from a man named Richard Shaver. Now, Shaver was a welder from Pennsylvania, and he wrote to the magazine claiming that he had discovered an ancient, sinister civilization living underground. He called them the Darrows.
And according to Shaver, these Darrows were responsible for, pretty much all the catastrophes on the surface world. He said he could hear their voices, that they used advanced technology, these rays, to cause accidents and disasters.
Now, the context here is important. Shaver himself, he had a history.
He did. He had a documented history of psychiatric hospitalization and was treated for paranoid schizophrenia. From his perspective, these voices were absolutely real. He believed it.
But Palmer
saw a marketing opportunity, a huge one. He took Shaver's, frankly, disordered and rambling letters, and he rewrote them. He polished them into coherent narratives and then published them in Amazing Stories as fact.
And the public response was just massive.
It was. The magazine's circulation exploded. People wrote in by the thousands claiming they too heard the Darrows or had seen strange things that confirmed Shaver's stories. It created this community of believers almost overnight.
But the crucial moment, the point where this crosses over from, underground monsters to things in the sky, that happens in 1947.
June 24th, 1947. This is the date that most historians of the phenomenon mark as the real beginning of the modern UFO era.
This is Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot. He's flying his plane near Mount Rainier in Washington.
And he reports seeing 9 objects flying past the mountain at what he calculated to be supersonic speeds, which in 1947 was unheard of for any known aircraft. He described their motion as being like a saucer skipping across water.
And the press, of course, immediately shortened that to flying saucer. That term just stuck. It entered the lexicon immediately.
It did. But here's a connection that often gets overlooked. The part that ties the legitimate, credible witness to the world of pulp fiction. Kenneth Arnold wasn't just some random pilot who saw something and that was the end of it.
No. Shortly after his sighting, Raymond Palmer, the very same pulp editor from Chicago, he contacts Arnold.
Palmer wanted Arnold, this new celebrity witness, to investigate another sighting. And this is where the worlds of credible pilots and pulp fiction conspiracy just completely merge. Palmer hired Arnold to look into the Maury Island incident, also in Washington state.
This is a bizarre story. A man named Fred Chrisman claimed he was out on his boat with his son and a dog, and he saw these 6 donut-shaped craft. He said one of them seemed to be in trouble, and it dropped a payload of what looked like slag-like hot lava rocks onto his boat.
He had allegedly injured his son and killed the dog, so very dramatic story.
So Kenneth Arnold, the credible pilot, flies out to Tacoma to meet this Fred Chrisman. Chrisman gives him these lava rocks as evidence, but the story just gets darker and more convoluted from there.
Arnold feels he's out of his depth. He calls in 2 Army Air Force intelligence officers, a Captain Davidson and a Lieutenant Brown, to help investigate. They interview Chrisman, they take samples of the rocks, and they get on a B-25 bomber to fly back to their base in California.
And the plane catches fire and crashes. Both officers were killed.
This tragedy just solidified the conspiratorial tone. A local newspaper immediately ran a story suggesting the plane was sabotaged. The idea was that someone wanted to prevent this evidence from reaching the authorities.
And then it all falls apart.
It does. It turned out the Maury Island incident was a complete hoax. Chrisman and his partner later confessed to making it all up. The lava rocks were just ordinary rocks from a local smelter. They were trying to get publicity, maybe a magazine deal.
But the damage was done. You have this perfect template for a conspiracy, a mysterious sighting, men in suits, because Chrisman also claimed a man in a black suit had warned him to stay silent.
The first Man in Black story, really.
And then you have dead military officers. It established the whole playbook.
Yeah.
The government knows something. People who get too close die, and the truth is suppressed. And all of this was happening in the summer of 1947. The same summer as Roswell.
Which brings us to a really important correction in the historical record.
Yeah.
When you or I think of UFO conspiracies today, Roswell is the centerpiece. It's ground zero.
Of course.
But in the late 1940s and all through the 1950s and even the 60s, Roswell was a non-story. It was completely forgotten.
That's surprising to hear. The Army Air Force did put out a press release in July 47 saying they had recovered a flying disc. They retracted it the very next day, claiming it was just a weather balloon. You would think that retraction alone would spark immediate outrage and suspicion.
You'd think so, but it didn't. The public and the press largely accepted the weather balloon explanation at the time. There were a few mentions here and there, but the story just faded away. It was gone for over 30 years. The conspiracy narrative of the 1950s was built around entirely different events and different people.
So who was building that narrative? If it wasn't about Roswell, what was it about?
The primary architect of that 1950s narrative was a man named Donald Keyhoe. And unlike Palmer, Keyhoe wasn't a pulp editor. He had an air of authority. He was a former Marine Corps major.
So he had credibility.
He had a lot of credibility. He wrote for True magazine, which was a very popular men's adventure magazine. In 1949, he wrote a hugely influential article titled "The Flying Saucers Are Real."
And what was his argument?
His core argument, at first, was that the Air Force knew these objects were interplanetary vehicles, but they were afraid of causing a public panic. He frequently referenced the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast as the reason for the secrecy.
The Orson Welles broadcast that famously caused panic.
Exactly. But over the course of the 1950s, Keyhoe's rhetoric started to escalate. He went from simply reporting on sightings and suggesting a gentle cover-up to actively accusing a specific silence group within the government of orchestrating a malicious conspiracy.
And there was a moment, a really specific moment on live television in 1958 that seemed to prove Keyhoe right in the eyes of millions of viewers.
Yes, this was a critical event. He was on a CBS show, the Armstrong Circle Theater, which was a very well-regarded dramatic anthology series. This episode was a debate about UFOs.
And Keyhoe was on the show live.
Live television. And he deviated from the pre-approved script that the network censors had cleared. He looked directly at the camera and he said, "And now I'm going to reveal something that has never been disclosed before."
And at that exact moment,
His microphone was cut. The audio just went dead. The host of the show had to awkwardly step in and say they were having technical difficulties.
Now, the network later claimed it was a technical glitch or that they were simply censoring unverified statements as per their policy. But for the viewer at home watching that happen,
It looked like the silence group had just reached right into their living rooms and shut them down. It was this incredibly powerful visual validation of the entire conspiracy. It cemented that us versus them dynamic. If the government silences the messenger, the message must be true.
So while Kehoe is fighting this public battle with the Air Force, another narrative thread is taking shape. This one is about crash saucers. But again, since Roswell was forgotten, the big story in 1950 wasn't Roswell, it was Aztec, New Mexico.
That's right. This came from a book by an author named Frank Scully. The book was called Behind the Flying Saucers, and it was a bestseller.
And what did Scully claim?
He claimed that a massive saucer, almost 100 feet in diameter, had crashed in Aztec and that the military had secretly recovered it. But more than that, he claimed they recovered 16 humanoid bodies.
16?
16 bodies. He described them as being very small, only about 3 feet tall, and dressing in a kind of metallic cloth. He even had details about their diet, that they lived on concentrated food wafers.
This story has all the elements that we now associate with Roswell. The crash, the bodies, the military cover-up.
It has everything. But it wasn't a military secret. It wasn't true at all. It was a con.
So straight-up swindle.
Correct. It was a fraud orchestrated by 2 confidence men, Silas Newton and a man named Leo Gebauer, who went by Dr. Gee. They were trying to sell fake oil-detecting devices to investors.
And they claimed the technology for these devices was
based on alien technology from the crashed Aztec saucer. They fed the entire story to Frank Scully, who was a columnist, and he published it without, it seems, verifying any of their sources.
And it was eventually debunked.
Yes. A journalist for True magazine, the same one Kehoe wrote for, exposed the entire thing as a hoax in 1952. But just like with Maury Island, the idea was now out there. The image of the crashed saucer with bodies had entered the cultural lexicon long before Roswell became famous.
And along with the bodies, we get the enforcers of the silence.
The Men in Black.
This comes from a 1956 book by Gray Barker titled They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. This is really where the term Men in Black enters the public consciousness.
Barker's book focused on the story of a researcher named Albert Bender, who claimed he discovered the truth about UFOs, but was visited by 3 men in dark suits who threatened him into silence. Barker described these agents as being expressionless, almost supernatural, driving new black Cadillacs.
Barker was a bit of a showman, wasn't he?
He was a complex figure. He often admitted privately that he embellished or even fabricated stories for entertainment value. He wanted to sell books. However, there was a grain of truth to the core idea.
Meaning government agents really were visiting witnesses.
Yes. During the Cold War, the CIA and the Air Force were genuinely concerned about the UFO phenomenon. Not because they believed in aliens, but because they worried that a flood of public reports could mask a surprise Soviet bomber attack, or that it could be used by the Soviets to cause mass hysteria.
So they wanted to discourage public interest.
Exactly. So Air Force and FBI agents did visit witnesses and tell them to stop talking about what they saw, for reasons of national security. They probably weren't as supernatural as Barker described, but the intimidating visit from a man in a suit from the government, that part was real.
Okay, so as we move into the 1960s and 70s, the entire atmosphere in America changes. The general trust in the government it evaporates.
It's a seismic shift. You have the assassinations of President Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, you have the Vietnam War dividing the country, and then, of course, Watergate.
And the conspiracy theories adapted to this new environment of distrust.
They had to. The government was no longer seen as just withholding information to prevent panic. That was almost a paternalistic, benevolent view. The new view was that the government was actively malevolent, deceptive, criminal.
And this is when a key figure from the Air Force's own investigation switches sides.
J. Allen Hynek. He was an astronomer, and he had been the Air Force's chief scientific consultant for Project Blue Book for years. His job was to debunk sightings.
Famously, he's the one who came up with swamp gas to explain a major sighting in Michigan.
That's right. But by the 70s, he had become convinced that there was a genuine phenomenon that the Air Force was covering up, and he coined a term for it that perfectly captured the post-Watergate mood. He called it a cosmic Watergate.
It implies a cover-up of criminal proportions. It's not about panic anymore, it's about a crime.
Exactly. And speaking of crimes, the 1960s gives us one of the most bizarre callbacks in this entire 80-year history. A character from the very beginning resurfaces.
Fred Chrisman, the man from the 1947 Maury Island hoax with the lava rocks.
The very same. In 1968, Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, is conducting his famous investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And he subpoenas Fred Chrisman.
Why? What did Garrison think Chrisman had to do with the JFK assassination?
Garrison believed Chrisman was connected to the intelligence community, and that he was one of the 3 tramps who were famously arrested in Dealey Plaza right after the assassination.
That's an incredible leap.
It is. Chrisman was never convicted of anything regarding JFK, and the connection is extremely tenuous. But the fact that a known UFO hoaxer was pulled into the orbit of the JFK investigation forged this permanent link in the grand conspiracy lore. It suggested that the same shadowy people who were covering up UFOs were also involved in killing presidents.
The ultimate deep state theory.
It laid the groundwork for it, absolutely.
So as we get into the 1970s, the crash retrieval stories start to come back, but with new details.
Yes. In 1974, an author named Robert Spencer Carr revived the old Aztec story from the 1950s, but he added a new, very specific detail. He claimed the alien bodies weren't just recovered, but that they were being stored at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, in a specific place, Hangar 18.
The Air Force, of course, denied that a Hangar 18 even existed.
They did, but the specificity of Carr's claim, he talked about morgues, cryogenic preservation, secret autopsies, it caught the public imagination. It even became the subject of a film in 1980 called Hangar 18.
But the biggest development of the late 70s, the one that reshaped the entire landscape, was the resurrection of Roswell.
The return of the king, so to speak.
As we've said, Roswell had been a footnote for 30 years. That all changed in 1978, and it changed because of one man's persistence, Stanton Friedman.
Friedman was a nuclear physicist who became a full-time ufologist. He was a meticulous researcher, and he decided to track down the key players from the original 1947 incident. He found Jesse Marcel.
Marcel was the intelligence officer at Roswell Army Airfield in 1947. He was the one who initially went out to the ranch and collected the debris. He was pictured in the papers with the weather balloon debris.
Right, and Friedman interviewed Marcel, who was now retired. And for the first time, Marcel went on the record. He admitted that the weather balloon explanation was a cover story that he had been ordered to go along with by his superior, General Ramey.
What did Marcel claim the real material was like?
He described material as otherworldly, a metallic foil that was incredibly light but couldn't be wrinkled or dented, even with a sledgehammer. He talked about small I-beams with strange purplish hieroglyphics on them. He was adamant that it was nothing made on this earth.
And this interview, followed by the 1980 book The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, it just transformed everything.
It did. It moved Roswell from a forgotten press release to the absolute holy grail of ufology. It became the event. And it perfectly set the stage for the 1980s, an era that scholars often refer to as the dark side of ufology.
The dark side. Why that term?
Because the narrative shifted dramatically. It moved away from benevolent space brothers or simple government cover-ups to something much, much more sinister. The key themes became abduction, mutilation, and worst of all, government collaboration with malevolent alien forces.
This era is dominated by a few key figures, but one name really stands out for the sheer complexity of his involvement: Richard Doty.
Richard Doty is one of those critical and controversial figures in this entire history. He was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, or AFOSI, stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico.
Ugh.
And his story is a prime documented example of government disinformation.
And his target was a man named Paul Benowitz.
Yes, Benowitz was a successful businessman and an amateur physicist who lived right next to the base in Albuquerque. He had set up sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment in his home, and he believed he was picking up signals from alien spacecraft that were flying in and out of the base.
And instead of just ignoring him as a crank, the Air Force, through Doty, engaged with him.
They did more than just engage. Doty was tasked with essentially feeding Benowitz's beliefs. He provided him with confirming disinformation.
What kind of disinformation?
He gave him forged documents. He fed him false stories about a secret underground alien base at Dulce, New Mexico. He told him that there was a treaty between the U.S. government and a faction of aliens known as the Greys. He told him these aliens were abducting humans and implanting them, and that they were conducting horrific experiments in these underground bases.
Why? What was the goal of telling him all this?
The official explanation that has emerged since is that Benowitz, with his monitoring equipment, was getting close to picking up signals from real, highly classified military projects, things like stealth aircraft prototypes and early drone programs. The goal was to distract him, to send him down a rabbit hole so deep he would discredit himself and stop looking at what was really happening.
But the result for Benowitz was a personal tragedy.
A complete tragedy. He became increasingly paranoid. He believed he was the first and only line of defense against a hostile alien invasion. His family reported that he was stockpiling weapons, barely sleeping. He was eventually hospitalized for a severe nervous breakdown.
And yet the lies that Doty told Benowitz, These specific, detailed lies about the Dulce Bays, the treaties, the vats of human parts, they didn't just disappear with Benowitz.
No, they leaked out. They spread through the UFO research community like wildfire. And they became the foundational myths of the 1980s and 90s. If you hear a story today about a secret alien war happening underground at Dulce, you are very likely hearing the echo of a specific disinformation campaign that was designed to confuse and neutralize one man in Albuquerque.
Another key element of this dark side era was the phenomenon of cattle mutilations.
Right. All through the 70s and 80s, ranchers, particularly in the Midwest, were finding cattle dead under bizarre circumstances. Organs were removed with what looked like surgical precision, and often the bodies were completely drained of blood.
And these were often associated with reports of silent helicopters seen in the area around the same time.
Exactly. The conspiracy theory that emerged was that aliens were harvesting genetic material with government complicity, the silent helicopters being the government escort. However, if you look at the military hardware at the time, we know that the CIA and special operations units were developing and using extremely quiet helicopters.
Like the Hughes 500P.
The quiet one, as it was called. It was developed during the Vietnam War for covert operations. So it is entirely plausible that what people were seeing were secret military operations, perhaps environmental monitoring for radiation after nuclear tests or something similar, and that was being interpreted through this pre-existing lens of alien intervention.
The 80s also gave us probably the most famous or infamous set of documents in UFO history.
The Majestic 12 or MJ-12 documents.
In 1984, a television producer named Jamie Shandera, who was working with ufologist Bill Moore, received an anonymous package in the mail. Inside was a roll of undeveloped 35mm film.
And when Shandera had the film developed, it showed photographs of what appeared to be highly classified government documents from the 1940s and 50s.
What did these documents describe?
They described a top-secret committee called Majestic 12. They claimed it was set up by an executive order from President Truman in 1947, specifically to manage the recovery and analysis of the Roswell crash and any subsequent alien technology. The documents listed 12 members, including top scientists like Vannevar Bush and military leaders like General Hoyt Vandenberg.
On the surface, this seemed to be the smoking gun, the absolute proof of the cover-up.
It did, but almost immediately, the documents began to fall apart under scrutiny from researchers and forensic analysts.
What were the flaws?
There were numerous red flags. For example, the typewriter font used in one of the key documents, the Eisenhower briefing document, didn't exist in the 1950s. It was a font available on modern typewriters. Another major issue was the signature of President Truman on one memo. It was proven to be a photocopy, an exact duplicate of his signature from a completely unrelated and unclassified letter he had written to Vannevar Bush that was available in the National Archives.
It was a forgery.
A fairly clumsy one, it turned out. And then came the confession. At a MUFO Mutual UFO Network conference in 1989, Bill Moore, the researcher who had worked with Shandera to promote the documents, stood up and gave a stunning speech.
What did he admit?
He admitted that he had been working with Richard Doty and other agents from AFOSI. He confessed to being part of the disinformation campaign targeting Paul Benowitz, and he admitted to deliberately feeding fake evidence and rumors to other researchers in exchange for promises from the AFOSI agents that they would eventually give him the real truth.
That must have fractured the community.
It was a betrayal that sent shockwaves through the field. It created immense distrust. But the MJ-12 story was just too compelling to die. It survived the debunking and the confession, and is still debated today.
And this narrative of a shadow government, this Majestic 12, was then amplified and taken to a whole new level by two other figures, John Lear and Bill Cooper.
Yes. John Lear, who had a famous name as the son of the Learjet founder, and Bill Cooper, who claimed to be a former Naval Intelligence Briefing Team member, they took the mythology that came out of the Doty and Benowitz affair, and they expanded it exponentially.
Cooper especially, his 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, is arguably one of the most influential conspiracy texts of the modern era.
Without a doubt, Cooper didn't just talk about UFOs, he wove them into this grand, unified conspiracy theory that included the Illuminati, the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, the entire New World Order narrative.
He claimed the government was aiding and abetting a malevolent alien nation in exchange for technology, while allowing the aliens to abduct and mutilate humans and cattle for sustenance.
His work was incredibly dark and paranoid. And it's what really moved UFOs out of the fringe of hobbyists and scientific curiosity and into the political domain of right-wing militia movements and anti-government extremists. He shifted the focus from what are they to We must resist them.
And right at the end of this incredibly dense decade, in 1989, we get the man who single-handedly put Area 51 on the map.
Bob Lazar.
Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas news station with journalist George Knapp. He claimed that he had worked at a secret facility called S4, which was located near the Groom Lake test site, or Area 51.
And his claims were incredibly specific. He described 9 flying discs that were housed in hangars built into the side of a mountain. He claimed he worked on reverse engineering their propulsion systems, which he said ran on an antimatter reactor fueled by a stable isotope of element 115.
Lazar's story has always been contentious, to say the least. There were major questions about his background.
Huge questions. He claimed to have master's degrees from MIT and Caltech, but investigative journalists could find no record of his attendance at either institution. Then, in 1990, he was arrested for pandering, for helping to run a brothel in Nevada.
His credibility was severely damaged.
It was, and yet, his story, his description of the facility and the sport model saucer, it became iconic. Before Bob Lazar, Area 51 was a known but very obscure military test site. After Bob Lazar, it became a global tourist destination and the central headquarters of all UFO folklore.
So as we move out of the 80s and into the 1990s, all of these dark, complex stories, they leave the underground newsletters and explode into the mainstream. You see this massive feedback loop between pop culture and the conspiracy theories.
It's a perfect storm. The narratives created by Doty, Cooper, and Lazar become the actual plot lines for the most popular television show of the decade, The X-Files, which premiered in 1993.
The show's tagline, "The truth is out there," and its central mantra, "Trust no one," just perfectly captured the zeitgeist of the era.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you also had blockbuster films like Independence Day and Men in Black. Fiction began to validate and reinforce the beliefs. If you saw a government cover-up involving aliens on the X-Files every single week, the idea that it might be happening in reality felt much more plausible. The show even directly referenced Cooper's work, like the document Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars.
But the 90s also saw one of the most audacious and ultimately embarrassing hoaxes in the history of the subject.
The alien autopsy footage.
In 1995, a British music and video producer named Ray Santilli released footage that he claimed was a secret military film from 1947 of an autopsy being performed on an alien body recovered at Roswell.
And it was a global sensation. The Fox network in the U.S. aired it as a primetime special, hosted by Jonathan Frakes from Star Trek. Millions of people watched it.
And it looked, to the untrained eye, pretty convincing. It was grainy, black and white, the camera work was shaky. It had the feel of a real 1940s film.
It did. But it was a complete fabrication. Years later, Santilli and his partners confessed that it was a recreation. It was filmed in a living room in a London apartment.
And the alien?
The alien was a mannequin, a sculpture filled with sheep brains, raspberry jam for the blood and gore, and chicken entrails. It was a stunning example that showed 50 years after Maury Island, the public appetite for a smoking gun was so strong it could still blind people to obvious deception.
Then, in 1997, we had a very real, very widespread sighting event. The Phoenix Lights.
This was a major event. Thousands of people across the state of Arizona, including police officers and pilots, saw a massive V-shaped formation of lights move silently over the state for several hours.
And the official reaction to this was interesting.
To say the least. Fife Symington, who was the governor of Arizona at the time, held a press conference to address the public's concern. He said he'd investigated and would now reveal the culprit.
And he brought out his chief of staff, dressed in a cheap rubber alien costume, with big googly eyes. He completely mocked the event.
It diffused the situation with laughter. But here's the twist. Years later, after he was out of office, Symington admitted that he had seen the craft himself that night. He said it was otherworldly, enormous, and that as an experienced pilot, he had no explanation for it. He confessed that he mocked the event publicly, specifically to prevent a panic.
Which is the exact justification Donald Kehoe was talking about back in the 1950s.
The exact same one. It's a recurring theme.
This brings us into the 21st century, and we see another major shift in strategy. The focus moves from hunting for saucers in the desert to lobbying Congress for documents, the era of disclosure.
This really begins in earnest with Dr. Stephen Greer and his Disclosure Project. In 2001, he held a famous event at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where he brought forward dozens of military and government witnesses who all testified to their experiences.
But the major pivot point, the thing that brought this into the mainstream media in a serious way, was the 2017 New York Times article.
That article was a bombshell. It revealed the existence of a secret Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. It had a multi-million-dollar budget to study what the military was now calling unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs.
And this gave us the new face of the movement, Luis Elizondo.
Elizondo was a former career intelligence official who claimed he had run the ATIP program. He resigned from the Pentagon, he said, in protest, claiming that critical information about the UAP threat was being suppressed and not taken seriously by senior leadership.
And unlike the pulp editors or the confessed hoaxers of the past, here you have credentialed senior government insiders leading the charge.
It completely changed the tone of the conversation. Suddenly, major news outlets were covering it. It wasn't about believing in aliens anymore. It was framed as a matter of national security and flight safety for our military pilots.
And this all culminated in the testimony of David Grush.
Yes. In July 2023, David Grush, a former high-level intelligence official from the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, testified under oath to a congressional oversight committee.
And his claims were explosive. He claimed the U.S. government has a secret, decades-long program that has retrieved craft of non-human origin.
And not just craft. He also testified that biologics, dead non-human pilots, had been recovered.
But we have to apply the same historical lens here. Grush, by his own admission during that hearing, had not seen these things firsthand.
That's the critical detail. He was reporting what he was told by other, allegedly first-hand witnesses within the intelligence community. In essence, he was a whistleblower about what other people were saying. This mirrors the whisper campaigns we saw in the 1980s with Doty and Moore. The stories circulate within the classified world, they get passed from person to person, and they reinforce themselves.
And the scientific community remains skeptical because despite the sworn testimony, the one thing that has been missing for 80 years is still missing.
The hard physical evidence, the actual piece of metal, the body, something that can be independently analyzed in the public sphere, that remains absent.
And the counter-narratives that have emerged recently are just as fascinating. In 2025, the Wall Street Journal published a report that offered a very different explanation for some of these internal military stories.
That was a significant report. It detailed, through interviews with former Air Force personnel, how for decades, some new recruits assigned to classified programs were falsely told about alien technology programs.
Why would they do that?
For a few reasons. Sometimes it was a form of hazing ritual, a kind of fraternity prank that spun out of control. Other times it was used as a cover story. If a junior officer stumbled upon a highly classified stealth aircraft test, it was easier and more effective to let them think it was alien tech than to risk exposing the real secret.
So it suggests that some of the whistleblowers may be telling the truth as they know it.
But that they themselves had been intentionally deceived by their own superiors, not to hide aliens, but to hide human secrets, or even just to mess with the new guy.
We also saw the documentary The Age of Disclosure, released in early 2025, which featured other former officials like Jay Stratton, who was a leader on the UAP task force, claiming to have seen evidence of non-human intelligence.
And in late 2025, reports surfaced regarding a book by Dr. James Lakatsky, another former DIA employee who worked on these programs, claiming that some reverse engineering efforts had actually been successful. So the claims continue to come from credible people.
The cycle just continues. You have credible people making incredible claims based on classified information that the public, by definition, cannot verify. It is the same fundamental structure as the Kehoe era, the Benowitz era, and the Lazar era, just with more impressive resumes.
That's a perfect summary.
So after this whole journey, this 80-year history, what is the pattern that you see?
The pattern is adaptation. The story is a mirror. In the 1940s, the conspiracy was about lonely writers and welders hearing voices from inside the Earth. In the 50s, it was about a paternalistic government trying to prevent panic in a post-war world.
Then in the 70s and 80s, it became dark and paranoid, reflecting that massive loss of trust in our institutions.
Exactly. And today, the conspiracy is bureaucratic. It's about whistleblowers and congressional oversight committees and fighting over redacted PDFs. The core story evolves to perfectly fit the fears, the hopes, and the language of the generation that is telling it.
It seems that whether the actual secret at the core of all this is swamp gas or secret military tech, or a long-running hazing ritual, or actual visitors from another world, the story of the cover-up has become the most durable part. It's a modern mythology that survives every single debunking because its logic is circular. It relies on the idea that the real truth is always just one more leaked document, one more whistleblower away.
It provides a framework, a way to make sense of a chaotic and often frightening world. It suggests that someone, somewhere, is in control, even if they're keeping secrets from us. And for many people, that is a very powerful and comforting narrative to hold on to.
We want to thank you for joining us on this exploration of the archives. We hope it sheds some light on some very deep shadows. Thanks for listening.